Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, are you able to hear me?
Okay.
Good afternoon, Brother Scott.
There we go. Peace. Oh, it's so excellent to see you all. Oh, this is good. This is good. I want to go ahead and get started on time, and I don't want to make a mistake. My last panel, I want to start by opening in prayer. And so let us pray. Most merciful Creator, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to be at work. We pray that your spirit will be in our hearts and minds and guide our hearts and minds to love and truth. Amen.
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 All right. So I want to first welcome everybody to the 14th annual Jubilee Film Festival and the 56th anniversary of the Right to Vote movement and the Selma to Montgomery March and Bloody Sunday. And, you know, I want to start by sharing with you something of the subject matter and our relationship to it. My name is Scott Muhammad. I am co-director of the Jubilee Film Festival. And we started chipping away at a series that we call the Post-Traumatic Assassination Syndrome. And this title comes from the Reverend James Luther Bevel, who gave us this assignment, myself in particular, on his deathbed. He also shared this assignment with other students, but he shared it as he was dying. So it's an assignment that I take very seriously. When he told us that he wanted us to begin working on a post-traumatic assassination syndrome, he did not define that work for us. He just told us to work on it. And I started trying to understand, what it meant. And I knew that part of it dealt with studying the effects of the assassinations of particularly our revolutionary leaders on successive generations. And I started trying to find stuff to read, and I was sharing with some people that one of the things I read was from Francis Cress Welsing. I have not been able to find this book. It was an early, I think, precursor to the ISIS papers. I believe it was the Cress theory of color. And she was talking, and it might even been like an article or something where she was talking about her research for the book. And as she spoke about her research for this book, she said she went around to high schools and middle schools in her area searching for materials for her book. And in the course of this, she was interviewing Black high school boys and middle school boys, and she was asking them, what do you want to be, when you grow up? And this would have been like 72, 73, maybe, in fact, it may have even been as late as 76. And she was asking this question, and she said she got this wide range of answers from these boys, basketball, sports, music, song, all kind of answers. She said, but the one answer she did not get that she was looking for was nobody said they wanted to be a Black leader. And then we asked the question, what happens to Black leaders? And y'all, what happens to Black leaders? Everybody said they get killed. This is something that's on all of our conscious And anybody can tell you that. Anybody would give you that answer. But it's not something that's discussed in consciousness. It's not something that's dealt with. It's not something that's reasoned through. It's just something that hangs on us. In that we are celebrating or commemorating Bloody Sunday and the right to vote movement and the Selma to Montgomery March. These were Bevel's movements. He was the strategist behind the right to vote movement. He was the genius behind the Selma to Montgomery March. And I want to start off with a clip that we can hear from him. I want to share that I had the blessing to speak with Minister Farrakhan about 2 weeks ago, my wife and I. And in that conversation, you know, he exhorted us. He said, Reverend Bevel was a great man among us, and his name should never die. You got to keep his name alive. And so I'd like to introduce to some of us who do not know Reverend Bevel, I'd like to introduce you to him in this clip. Do we have it? Uh-oh. Well, okay. Well, we're having some technical issues. While we're having them, though, what I will share about Reverend Bevel is this. You know, he's widely acknowledged as being the man who called the March on Washington, and he talked about that. And he also dealt with the Selma to Montgomery March. And Minister Louis Farrakhan acknowledges him as being the man who brought the idea of atonement to the Million Man March. And I know him from his atonement work, and the post-traumatic assassination syndrome is all wrapped up in the atonement work. And so we're ready. Let's hear from Reverend Bevel.
In this country, it seems like everything has fallen apart into separate interests and groups, and nothing has happened.
Well, what happened is that a lot of people, we can talk about the social accomplishments, but let's talk about what happened to the heart and the psyche of the American people. One, we had for the first time a young, vigorous president. He was murdered. No due process. Nobody knew what happened. Everybody felt vulnerable. The president's brother, who was the senator, who was running for president, the candidate, was murdered. No due process. The loudest voice, the voice of Dr. King, the prophet, was murdered. No due process. So that the American people went through a state of shock, a state of losing their nerves. That was deliberate. That was intended by those who did not want the American people to become mature, to become, you know, Kennedy, a lot of people forget the impact that Kennedy had on the world. Kennedy initiated the space program. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's high science, that's high tech, and then all of the spin-off scientific project that came from that. And then Kennedy inspired the African American people because he was the first president who would acknowledge the truth or intelligence of a black person or female in public. Any president before that, if a female or a black person was intelligent in public, the president, the official would pretend like the person was crazy or they didn't hear them. So Kennedy put government more or less on the academic level. So you felt that you were not in a political brawl, you felt that you were in an academic or an academy setting discussing issues that scientifically you could work out. So Kennedy changed the whole psychology of America, and that released the images of the young people, of the American people. And so when we keep going back to that point, we're simply saying, no, we have to go back to the fundamental principles of America, of what it is and how it worked. That you have to respect the dignity of all people, and you have to authentically work for the dignity of all people. And Kennedy was about that, and King was about that. And you had a lot of people about that. When you go back and you look at a whole array of leadership, that was like a breakthrough. And something happened, all of this murder took place to keep this activity from going on. And we must not be intimidated and put to sleep out of the shock of murder. We have to investigate that and solve those problems. But as a nation, we must come to maturity.
So that was Reverend Bevel discussing his idea. It of course went deeper. And I want to add something to it. It's from a book by Harold Weisberg. It is called The Assassination. And I just want to read a piece of what Mr. Weisberg wrote. Whether we agree with him or not is not necessarily the point, but just hear what he's saying. On page 241, he says, "The silence of the blacks continues more than 2 years after the greatest American leader they have produced was murdered. Not one appears to be interested in solving the crime, helping to solve it, or even seeing to it that history, especially black history, is set straight. This is difficult to comprehend for whose people experienced Auschwitz and Buchenwald, for there are no American gas chambers. It is difficult for one who's produced the Judenrat, those human Judas goats for the Nazi slaughters, for this country constitutes no such environment, even if it does in some ways resemble the days of Prelude. But silence is no less awful when it is black silence. It may be worse, for whether he was liked or not by his peers, whether they were in accord with his views and methods or not, this was their American Nobel laureate, their only leader of true international prominence, an articulate, charismatic man recognized and respected by most of the black masses, the embodiment of black American hope. He had become the symbol, the public symbol of black bravery, the end to black fears of the white hood and the legal official surrogates of the night riders, of black emergence from 4 centuries of denial and terrorization, and of self-liberation from fear and the fear of repression. To permit the murder of such a man to go unsolved and to be officially obfuscated, to permit prostitution of the judicial process, so symbolic of that which for centuries had victimized the blacks without searching for the truth, was asked any question to me, self-destructive. Regardless of motive, whether it be real or fancy, it is black abdication. Not one black, be he intellectual or political leader, militant or conservative, personally involved or a friend of the murdered, the disciple or competitor, not one of the so many made a single meaningful response of the few who responded at all. To me, this is someone outside of our community commenting on a condition of post-traumatic assassination syndrome. That's how I experience it. We are a film festival, and in our festival, which you can sign up for at 2021 Jubilee Film Festival.eventive.org, we have a film on the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, among others. And these films are unlimited viewing until Sunday night. I wanted to just touch on a couple of, kind of give a little bit of a context of the condition of post-traumatic assassination syndrome. We're not going to go deeply into it as a defined condition today. Today, we want to focus on Malcolm X. We'd already decided to do that when there was a deathbed confession by Mr., I think, Ray Wood. His letter was read by his cousin to the daughters of Malcolm X by Mr. Benjamin Crump. And this Mr. Wood was confessing his role as an undercover New York police officer working with the FBI and Bossy to murder Malcolm X. And one of our panelists today, student minister Demetric Muhammad, will get into that, I believe. But I want to introduce to you all someone who I believe will help us in understanding the implications, the context of this kind of activity of murder, particularly government initiated and sponsored murder of its citizens, in complete contradiction to its role of securing life. I want to ask, there's one more thing that I like to say before I turn it over. I asked each of the panelists to be here today on purpose. We have with us Dr. Clyde Robertson, the director of the Center for African and African American Studies. We have with us Mr. Dennis Speed of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche Movement. And we have student minister Demetric Muhammad, researcher from the Nation of Islam and author. We are seated in the virtual home space of the Selma movement, a movement led by Dr. King and Reverend Bevel and others. And we have with us one I would kind of consider a son of Malcolm and Dr. Robertson, a son of Lyndon LaRouche and Dennis Speed, and a son of the Honorable Farrakhan and Brother Demetric. One of the things that all of our movements have in common is the assassination, the false imprisonment, the social exiling of our leadership. I don't care what spectrum you claim or you think, or you don't like this one or this one don't like that one. When we sit down at the table together, we can all tell a story about how they murdered our leader, or how they trumped up and imprisoned our leader, or how they have exiled socially our leaders. And I wanted to take, in the spirit of atonement, because that's what Reverend Bevel was about, I wanted to take the opportunity to begin, and this is only a beginning. We do not have enough time to actually effectuate, but to begin the process of healing the divisions that exist between movements that have similar, same goals and objectives. So I would like to start with Mr. Dennis Speed of the Schiller Institute.
Thank you, Scott. Let me ask you a question so I'm clear. What do I have, about 15 minutes? Is that right? Oh, you can't hear me. Just a minute. Okay, are you able to hear me now? No?
We can't hear you. Your mic's not muted, but there's no sound.
Maybe the computer mic is muted.
Is your computer mic muted?
Let me just check here.
I can hear him.
Oh, okay.
Oh, are you on mute?
I can hear you as well, my brother.
All right. So it must, Scott, I think it's coming from your side. They're able to hear me. All right. Okay, great. Well, here's what I'll do. Regardless of what the time frame was supposed to be, I will set myself for 15 minutes. That way I don't violate. Matter of fact, I'll do later, less time. Let me do the following so that I might give a context quickly. And if I'm speaking too quickly, somebody just signal that to me.
Take your time.
My involvement here should be stated. Lyndon LaRouche, on March 17th, 1994, held a meeting together with Minister Louis Farrakhan and the Reverend James Bevel. Others were present at that meeting. and that meeting was held to discuss the beginning and emerging plans around the Million Man March. It was in that meeting that Reverend Bevel, in specific, began to elaborate the concept of atonement for the march, stating that if you were going to put 1 million Black men together, then they needed to atone for all of the things that they were doing wrong in their community that had made them so far incapable of addressing the then current state of affairs that existed. At one point, and I don't think it'd be a problem for this to be said now, in that discussion, there was a bit of a dispute as to whether the march was just going to be only 1 million Black men, or should be men and women or what. And Minister Farrakhan turned to Lyndon LaRouche and asked him, well, Mr. LaRouche, what do you think about this? And Lyndon LaRouche said, I have no problem with the idea of 1 million Black men. Matter of fact, let me just make something clear. Just the fact that we are meeting here today has terrorized the people on the other side of the street. Now, what he was referring to is that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, had its office on the other side of the street. He said, you know, we can sit here and say nothing, and we've already changed things in this country. I think this is important to understand because a lot of times people just don't have any conception, for many different reasons, of real history. In 1993, the year before this happened, it was in November of 93, November 20th, Lyndon LaRouche had an interview with an imam from Iowa. The interview was in Rochester Correctional Facility where LaRouche had been held for 5 years. And at one point, the imam asked LaRouche about a story that he had heard that LaRouche used to go to the Audubon Ballroom. And LaRouche said, yeah, I used to go there to hear Malcolm X. He said, I listened to him in 1964 when he was coming out. He said, now, a lot of people didn't go to hear him. And he said, but I did. Now, separate from the interview, what's relevant about this is that he told me something about Malcolm and what he saw and what Malcolm did. He said the thing that was most impressive to him about Malcolm is the way he took on what he found in the people he knew to be their problem. He said he would do imitations, he would do voices, he would do all sorts of things. He would get people to laugh or to think, and then he would say, see what you like? You see what you have to change? This is a critical element to understand this question of how one deals with a syndrome and the forms of injustice, which are often horrific. And I think we have to put that into context. Obviously, people know, and there's all sorts of books. There's this one, Malcolm X, the FBI File. You can find books on FBI infiltration of movements, CIA infiltration movements, and so on. There's all sorts of books. We don't find people doing much about it. In 1992, and this is how I came to be in that meeting with Minister Farrakhan and Lyndon LaRouche and Bevel. Bevel ran for vice president of the United States. I spent every day for about 4 months with him. And the reason that he did it, LaRouche was in jail. He was running with LaRouche. And what happened was there had been a dispute about whether he should do it. And the thing that was important was to LaRouche, he said, I said to him at one point, you know, you can't control anything that's going to come out of Bevel. Whatever Bevel's thinking, feeling, he says it. And LaRouche said to me, that's why I want him to run. I'm in jail. So back on what Scott was saying about this, I think this will be the final story I want to tell, and then I'll say a few things about the context of today, what we're in now. And I don't know, I had an assistant, Jose, if you can put that slide up for me, if it's there. If it's not, I'll try to read it myself. This is a quote from a man, many of you know who he is, Albert Woodfox. Spent 43 years and 10 months in solitary confinement. And he said this: many people wrote to me in prison over the years asking me how I survived 4 decades in a single cell, locked down 23 hours a day. I turned my cell into a university, I wrote to them, a hall of debate, a law school. By taking a stand and not backing down, I told them. I believed in humanity, I said. I loved myself, the hopelessness, the claustrophobia, the brutality, the fear. I didn't say those things. I looked out the window. Now, this is him now. He's getting out of jail this day. He says, a news van was parked down the road outside the jail, headlights still on, though it was getting light now. I'll be able to go anywhere to see the night sky. I sat on my bunk and I waited. So that was on February 19th, 2016. I think that's the day before Malcolm's birthday, if I'm not mistaken. So that was 5 years ago. This gentleman is now 74 years old. He had founded the Black Panther Party in jail. The way he founded the party was that he had escaped at the point that he had been sentenced to go to jail for 50 years. The day he got sentenced, I think he was about 22 years old, he escaped, went to New York, where he had run with some people. You know, he'd been involved in a lot of crime. And he met the Black Panther Party. And he said, I was treated in a way I had never been treated in my life. And I realized that they were saying to me, I didn't have to be the way I thought I was. And I changed my life. He was reapprehended, found at the party in jail, was accused of killing a prison guard together with a man by the name of Herman Wallace, refused to cop a plea, and spent 43 years and 10 months in solitary confinement. He's out. He's got a book. It's called Solitary. People should check it out. Came out last 2019, I think it was. It's a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And I think the end of it is called My Story of Transformation and Hope. This is a man that, in other words, was in jail for 16 years and 10 months longer than Nelson Mandela, right here in this country. And so when we talk about the concept of post-traumatic assassination syndrome, let's also talk about persons and individuals that have defied that, because the defiance of that is as important as the syndrome itself. Now, clearly we've seen, particularly I think people are aware that there's a movie called Judas and the Black Messiah, and it deals with the case of William O'Neill and what he did in terms of the murder of Fred Hampton and all like that. What you're really seeing when you look at that, these events, of course, about half a century ago, they shaped the lives of many of us. I was myself 15 years old when Dr. King was assassinated. Many of us went in certain directions at that point. My own case, I was involved with the Republic of New Africa. Some people know what that group was. Brother Mario Badele's, people like that. And I was at college during this period, got involved with Lyndon LaRouche in coming off that. But to get to the question of the syndrome and what you saw, if you were in a Black student union at that time, in my case, I was at Swarthmore College, and we happened to be the first place that received the COINTELPRO files. The reason for that was there were students from Haverford College. Swarthmore had 3 colleges, Swarthmore, Bryn Mawr, and Haverford. And so there were students from Haverford colleges were the ones that broke into the FBI office. Now, if you know the story about this, they were led by a professor from Haverford. And what they were trying to do was get draft cards, burn the documents that would cause the records of people not to have to go to Vietnam. But they accidentally, since they were there and they saw these other files, they pulled these files, which became known as the COINTELPRO files. This was in 1971. It's the first year I was in college. And it happened to be the case that since they were from that complex of colleges, they dropped off the files, the first actual expose of COINTELPRO happened at the college, Swarthmore, Phoenix. Several people were in it, in the files. I was not important at that point. I had just gotten to the college. I was a member of the Black Student Union, but the people that had come before, Don Mizell, some other people who did other things, they were in the FBI files. Matter of fact, they had the entire Black Student Union. Everybody was in the FBI file because they were part of the Black Student Union. And so for those of us who were even just going to college at that time, it wasn't really a choice. You could call it a choice, but only if you were a fool. You otherwise could understand and were caused to understand at that time. And this is, I think, what's really important about looking at something like this Judas and the Black Messiah story, or other of the stories we're going to tell. That generation's great advantage was that the assassinations also caused a response, a reaction. You had to choose, of course. And over the years, of course, many people have abdicated the choice they originally made. But when Minister Farrakhan called the Million Man March and called for the people to organize it, as was said earlier by Scott, this is the question of go get whoever's going to fight. It's a Magnificent Seven moment. It's not a question about who you like or who other people like, or whether somebody said something that was wrong or said it wrong about you. As, for example, I had in 1986 against the Nation of Islam. This is one of the first things that I discussed with Minister Farrakhan in 1993. It was a sort of a humorous occasion, but it was important because the point of reconciliation at that time was our mutual attack on the Anti-Defamation League. Our organization wrote a book about it. And so I think what I'll say in conclusion about the issue of the syndrome is that the crucial issue here, when you're talking about brainwashing, because that's what this is that in brainwashing, finally and ultimately, the victim of the brainwashing has to decide to not be a victim. But you, in order to make the decision, you have to decide to die. That's where the problem comes. If you are not ready to die, you cannot defeat your brainwasher. Because in other words, if your environment is so controlled that you've been placed in a condition in which you believe that every element of your life is controlled, unless you are willing to die for what you believe, you cannot break free. And so when we take about Albert Woodfox, let me just tell you a story. We're not going to do, I think, slides on this, but there's a program you should know about. NASA runs it. It's called Astrobiology for the Incarcerated. And they've got this program, 4 states are involved, and they go in and they are talking to inmates and they're talking to them about astrophysics. Something to recognize. People who spent time in solitary, of which there are literally 10,000 right now in Florida any given day, under a condition of 30 days solitary confinement, and the United Nations says 15 days of torture. People that spend time in solitary actually understand space travel and the conditions of space travel better than almost anybody else on the planet. Because the conditions of traveling in a capsule and traveling long distances require a fortitude, a sense of self, a sense of calm that may be better understood by those people than anybody else. Now, I'm not talking about the idea that solitary is a good thing. Obviously, it's not just inhuman and torturous. It's also designed to depopulate Black America of mentally stable warriors. That's why those people are on jail. We know that. That's exactly why you tend to get our leadership from people who come from jail or people who are about to be jailed. But I am saying this to you in conclusion. I believe that these syndromes are reversible, first of all, but you can't get to it unless you're willing to affiliate with leadership, which itself has proven that it's ready to die. Minister Farrakhan, I will just say, in this, I don't think would be a problem either, was the only real world figure except for Ramsey Clark, who at the point that Lyndon LaRouche died, February 12th, 2019, not just sent condolences, but sent, actually in this particular case, video, making it clear that he was proud to have known Mr. LaRouche, to have worked with him, and have listened to him, and to have learned from him. And when this was received, and it wasn't able to be shown in that we had a memorial, but we had a group of people together. When that was shown, the tension in the room could have been broken with a knife. That shows you, You see, that's the kind of quality of leadership you want. Leadership that causes tension, not because it's trying to make people uncomfortable, but because the truth and facing the truth creates a discomfort with falsehood. So falsehood and truth cannot be in the same mind. Falsehood will fall away from the mind if it confronts truth. And that is the issue of how you break this syndrome. So thank you very much, Brother Scott, and everybody else for listening. And we turn it back to you.
No, thank you, Brother Dennis. And I pray that you will stick around because I'm sure our audience will have questions, and I want them to experience you the way I have. And just to kind of, I'm gonna say camelback on something you said. I was speaking with Reverend Bevel one day about history and dying, and he said, well, you know, and in fact, I had to teach a history class because he was going to be out of town. So he told me to teach his history class. And I said, well, can you give me a definition of history? He said, sure. He said, history occurs when a man agrees to die so God can tell his story through him. So that's the only story that really matters. Everything else is an account of worms wiggling in compost. So I said, okay. And that was that. Thank you, brother. Next up, I have my dear brother, Dr. Clyde Robertson. It was interesting. If you notice, most of us are probably familiar with anytime there are forums on Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam is never invited. It's kind of strange, but we were at Tuskegee University and had a relationship with the chair of the history department, and he invited me to be on a panel with Dr. Robertson, and he invited the local imam, and he invited a sister who had history in the nation. And, you know, we all came together seamlessly, and we knew we would because we had did work together consequentially. You know, we stood against the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Board of Trustees of Tuskegee, when they tried to keep Minister Farrakhan from coming to Tuskegee. You know, so we all were clear. But I had to share with the students that technically we weren't supposed to be on the same stage together. There was supposed to be some tension in the fight because my brother loved Malcolm and I'm supposed to hate Malcolm. And the imam is supposed to hate us both. And it's like, nah, I understand my inheritance. I don't have to choose Malcolm or the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. They're both my inheritance. I don't have to choose the Nation of Islam and Malcolm or Dr. King. That's all my treasure. Call me greedy. I want it all. We need it all in this hour, you know. So I really appreciate Dr. Robertson, you taking the time to join us on this panel. And without further ado, please, would you share with us what's on your mind about our brother Malcolm X?
Certainly, brother. Sister Erica, Brother Scott, Brother Dennis, Brother Demetrius, and those in the listening audience, hotels and power. Power is important because powerless people rarely experience peace. In 1919, Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born poet, addressed the Red Summer of 1919 when across America, hundreds of African Americans were killed by marauding white mobs. Appalled by this vicious onslaught, McKay penned the following poem. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. Round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show ourselves brave. And for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What thou before us lives, the open grave? Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. I'm Dr. Clyde Robertson, Professor of Humanities and Director for the Center for African and African American Studies at Southern University at New Orleans. Brother Dennis, I know Brother Woodfuck very well. The previously read poem typifies the fighting spirit of African American leaders who were willing to sacrifice their own lives in order to salvage and secure Black people and our communities. Brother Dennis, again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Today, I will examine and honor one such leader in my presentation titled Omowale Malcolm Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, still relevant after 56 years. It's important to note that Omowale is a title that Malcolm was given in 1964 while sojourning in Nigeria. It's a Yoruba term, and it means in part a child who has returned or a son who has come home. 56 years ago, on February 5th, 1965, Omowale Malcolm Shabazz arrived in Selma, Alabama, invited by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC. The young civil rights activists wanted Malcolm to make it plain, or to provide an analysis of the African-American dilemma that was rarely revealed in mainstream civil rights circles. And on that faithful day, Malcolm introduced his now famous house Negro and field Negro analogy, proclaiming himself to be the quintessential field Negro. In addition, Malcolm trumpeted his growing allegiance to Martin Luther King, with whom he had inspired to coalesce. In fact, 56 years ago, he met with King's wife, Coretta Scott King, while King was in jail. Omowale Shabazz explained that he was in Selma not to confront King, but to augment and expand the civil rights movement. Coretta Scott King was impressed with Malcolm and said the following, and I quote, "I think if he had lived, and if the two had lived, I'm sure that at some point they would have come closer together and would have been a very strong force in the total struggle for liberation and self-determination of Black people in our society." Scott King would later call Omowale Shabazz a tremendous bridge who could have, along with her husband, uplifted and liberated African America. Soon thereafter, Malcolm would leave Selma and cross the threshold into immortality. When 56 years ago, on February 21st, 1965, Omowale Malik Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, as well as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, was assassinated by a cabal which was thought to have included a component of the New York Police Department, Bouassi, the FBI, and yes, even some members of the Nation of Islam. The murder of Omowale Malcolm Shabazz on that cold and dreary day ended his physical life. However, his dreams and aspirations of autonomous and thriving Pan-African worlds continue to occupy the imaginings of righteous people throughout Africa and her vast diaspora. Today, both young and old change agents are inspired by his speeches and theories and attempt to duplicate his methods of securing liberation, justice, and freedom for all people. His books, declamations, debates, interviews, and articles are at this very moment being studied, explored, and analyzed in the world's finest universities and think tanks, and yes, even at the 56th commemoration of Bloody Sunday. While there are literally tens of thousands of pages written by and about Malcolm, in my humble opinion, the most heartwarming words about this magnanimous champion were delivered on February 27th, 1965, by the great actor and eulogist, Ossie Davis. Here, at this final hour, in this quiet place, Davis writes, Harlem has come to bid farewell to one of its brightest hopes, extinguished now and gone from us forever. For Harlem, he writes, is where Malcolm worked and where he struggled and fought, his home of homes, where his heart was and where his people are. And it is therefore most fitting that we meet once again in Harlem to share these last moments with him. Malcolm, Davis continues, was our manhood, our living Black manhood. This was his meaning to his people. And honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. Davis concludes his touching soliloquy by saying, consigning these remains to earth, the common mother of us all, we are secure in the knowledge that what we place in the ground is no more now a man, but a seed, which after the winter of our discontent will come forth again and meet us, and we will see him for what he was and is, a prince, our own Black shining prince, who didn't hesitate to die, Brother Dennis, because he loved us so. The contemporary relevance of Omowale Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X, is found in the aforementioned eulogy. In this brief paper, I will demonstrate how Omowale Shabazz is now meeting us by continuing to influence African-American social ethical thinking and African-American social movements. According to the Afrocentric scholar and culturalist Maulana Karenga, Malcolm X began his career as an advocate with a concern for liberation and knowledge. In addition, Karenga asserts that Malcolm X's unwavering commitment to the autonomy of African people at home and abroad led him to unending searches for fairness and justice. From the moment he began his struggle to read and write in the Norfolk Colony prison cell, Omowale became engrossed with the pursuit of authenticity, accuracy, and most importantly, honesty. His newfound literary and burgeoning activism, born in prison, helped him develop a skill set that augmented his growing advocacy. While in prison, he sometimes wrote letters to the mayor of Boston, the governor of Massachusetts, and the president of the United States, then Harry Truman. His letters were about how the white man's society was responsible for the Black man's condition in the wilderness of North America. Of course, neither his concerns nor letters were ever answered. However, his earliest efforts to communicate with and confront the power structure demonstrates his innate and fearless desire to oppose unfairness and to pursue social justice. Karenga identifies three areas that informs and engages Malcolm X's social ethical ideology. 1, religion and spirituality. 2, culture. And 3, respect and equality of women. Omar Wali Malik Shabazz only believed in a religion that supported the global freedom struggles of righteous people, especially African people. He postulated that religion should not be relegated to simply saving souls. Malcolm thought that religion should stimulate the oppression and servitude of overly burdened people while they lived here on earth. I believe in a religion, says Malcolm, that believes in freedom. Anytime I have to accept a religion that won't let me fight for my freedom, I say hell to that religion. This single quote typifies his view that religion must adapt to the condition of its adherents if that religion is expected to help transform the social and ethical condition of the people. Culture is another area about which Malcolm X wrote and spoke voluminously. Culture, like religion, was a topic that ignited in Omar Wali Shabazz both passion and fervor. In fact, he understood that culture was used as armament, as an armament against African Americans. Black people, even on the continent of Africa, were taught to feel inferior and convinced to hate themselves and one another. Culture became weaponized, a weaponized tool used to perpetuate the appearance of mediocrity among Black people. We must capture our heritage and identity, asserts Malcolm, if we are ever to liberate ourselves from the bonds of white supremacy. He concludes his righteous diatribe by saying, we must launch a cultural revolution to unbrainwash a whole and entire people. By 1964, Omar Wali Shabazz's view of the role of women in society began to evolve with his expanding cosmology. His view of the role of women grew from one which encompassed basic protection and respect to the acceptance of equal merit and worth. We cannot forget that Malcolm was a historian and clearly understood that the impact African women generally and African American women specifically had on their personal environments and world. To this end, he posits, every country you got, Malcolm says, usually the degree of progress can never be separated from the woman. If you're in a country that's progressive, the woman is progressive. This evolution in his vision of women began with his ever-changing relationship and view of his wife, Dr. Betty Shabazz. After his separation from the Nation of Islam and his frequent long sojourns away from his home, he began to realize the transformative role that Betty had on the lives of their children and himself. That realization led to him re-examining his philosophy and treatment of all African-derived women. Social movement scholar Rhoda Bloomberg defines a social movement as a type of behavior in which large numbers of participants concisely attempt to change existing institutions and establish a new order of life. The Afrocentric scholar Andrew Smallwood leaps beyond this definition when examining the condition of African Americans and loudly asserts Africana social movements cannot only include, but go beyond the issue of social equality to address issues of social sovereignty, which include political, economic, and cultural dimensions expressed in collective behavior. This construct demonstrates a resistance to the institutional racism and cultural discrimination that African people, in particular in the United States, have faced and continue to face. Omowale Malik Shabazz follows a long line of African American activists who established social movements that addressed the ravages of white supremacy. David Walker, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, et al. Predated Malcolm X's activism and advocacy. However, it was Malcolm X's, Marcus Garvey, and Nation of Islam inspired demand that African Americans own and control the economic, educational, political, and social functions within their own communities that attracted younger activists and inspired social autonomy movements. In 1963, Malcolm proclaimed himself a Black nationalist. His uncompromising public criticism of global social oppression and imperialism, in addition to his calls for Black pride and power, propelled him to the top of the Black nationalists' pantheon of role models and heroes. Malcolm's demand for African American sovereignty, self-determination, and empowerment were ultimately duplicated by a plethora of African American organizations such as the Black Panther Party, US Incorporated, the Republic of New Africa, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and a host of local organizations at home and abroad. Omowale Malik Shabazz has now been associated with progressive movements such as Black Arts, Black Power, Black Student Unions, Black Studies movements, Black Liberation Theology, Hip Hop, and Black Lives Matter. As a result of his deep commitment, dedication, and love for the African world community, Omowale Malik Shabazz has become seminal and synonymous with progressive social movements for human rights, dignity, and sovereignty. Omowale Malik Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X, is not a relic to be sequestered and placed into the dark recesses of the world's moldy closet. He is not an old remnant to be shelved and forgotten. Malcolm's words, deeds, and legacy are both reminders of what courage and fearlessness in the face of overwhelming odds looks like. Some of you are not yet convinced that Malcolm is still relevant after 56 years. Well, 56 years ago, I.C. Davis said it best when he wrote, "Consigning these remains to earth, the common mother of us all, we are secure in the knowledge that what we place in the ground is no more now a man, but rather a seed, which after the winter of our discontent will come forth once again to meet us. And we will see him for what he was and is, a prince, our own Black shining prince, who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so." Brother Scott, panelists, and listening audience, I thank you for indulging me for these few minutes. And we always must remember that the struggle truly continues, but wherever you see struggle, you will find Malcolm. Again, Hotep, peace,
Thank you,
and power.
Dr. Robertson. I appreciate your contribution. This is full. You know, it's interesting. You know, we don't have time to get into it today, but I'm gonna have to get Dennis back on the panel so that we can talk about the atonement idea at the base of the Million Man March, Holy Day of Atonement. And I want to share something before I turn it over to my brother minister, Demetric. When I was younger, you know, I had kicked out of school for wearing a Malcolm X t-shirt. I was in the suburbs and they said that you couldn't wear it to school, and I wore it anyway. I got into Malcolm because I started listening to Brother Farrakhan. And the minister was very interesting because at the time, a lot of people, you know, I was in Chicago, you run into people who would talk, what we used to call, we say they talking greasy about the minister, you know. They just had a lot to say. And the minister would never respond to these people. And I saw an old tape of Brother Farrakhan in 1979. He was invited to Malcolm X College in Chicago to speak on the anniversary of Malcolm's death. And he did a beautiful lecture. It's on YouTube now. If you all haven't seen it, 1979, Minister Farrakhan at Malcolm X College. It is just, it's profound. His honesty, his truth, his fairness and justice is beautiful. 1979, he was just starting back up. Anyway, there was never at that time a connection between Minister Farrakhan and the murder of Malcolm X. Never. About 10, 12, 13 years later, about I guess 12 or 13 years later in 1991, 92, around there they started putting it together, and they associated him with the murder of Malcolm X with the release of Spike Lee's movie. And I think Brother Demetric has some exact dates with receipts of when they started trying to pin that on the minister. And so during Million Man March, Holy Day of Atonement, the spirit of that was for him to lead the nation in atonement. So when you do an atonement, you don't look for what's right. You scrape yourself. You scrape deep down trying to figure out what is my contribution to a conflict or a problem. And then you remove that conflict and the problem collapses, which is also the basis of nonviolent direct action. And the minister said, well, you know, in relationship to Malcolm X, because they were accusing him, he said, if I had a contribution, you know, he said, my contribution is that I spoke into an environment. You know, here's this, all this, you know, back and forth, you know, this arguing, and he spoke into it. And in the fighting between family members, then our open enemy was able to move in and assassinate Malcolm and had his hand. I was so blown away with the minister. While people were trying to pin a murder on him, that did not deter him from searching for his contribution to this conflict. And I saw that from the minister in the Nation of Islam, and the problem collapsed for Brother Farrakhan. He went, and in that state of like high vibrational purity through confession, this man attracted 2 million people to him on the Mall of DC. How did I know? How do we know that the atonement of Brother Farrakhan was real and it actually preceded his public utterance? He repented of speaking against other black men in the public after the Malcolm situation. So from that time to this, you cannot find a black person, male or female, that Minister Louis Farrakhan has ever disparaged publicly. And if you know him privately, you know he won't do it there either. In order for our community to heal, our brothers and sisters who also love Malcolm have to recognize their contribution to the conflict. They never do that. So the conflict continues for some of our family members. So Brother Farrakhan free, but many of my other brothers and sisters are not. They locked in the past. It's painful because they need what Elijah Muhammad brought, but they can't accept their inheritance from him. And they say, it's us against him. And we got to get over that. And the only way you can't fake it. Atonement is real, man. When we went out in that mall, the reason 2 million black men showed up and the reason the Spirit of God was there with us is because the man in the front of the march would not lie and was digging and scraping into himself. We got a spiritual problem here. We don't got no slick political problem that we can, rap and get out of. Oh, you got to come up and come through the narrow gate, man. We got to walk through the front door on this one. You see what I'm saying? It's like, nah, this man said that he spoke wrongly into an environment and that the enemy was able to manipulate that environment and murder his brother. So he don't do that anymore. But my other brothers still do it. They still come in the public, not only against Minister Farrakhan, against one another. All you got to do is have the right circumstance. So this, like I said, is the first step in our walk towards healing. These are going to be some hard conversations as we get down the road. They're supposed to be. These conversations got to be harder than the chains that bind us. You know what I mean? We got to break through those. So we got to have the hard conversations, the painful conversations on all sides so that we can actually heal, because the lives of our children are at stake. So I'm not going to hold this. I want to introduce our brother, student minister, Demetric Muhammad, who is on Minister Farrakhan's research team. The brother is a prolific author. I am holding this here. Y'all look, this book is called But Didn't Y'all Kill Malcolm? But Didn't Y'all Kill Malcolm? This is a myth-busting book, and it is one of the most beautiful pieces of scholarship. It's free of rancor. It's free of vileness. It's no attacks. It is a defense of our community. And I'm so thankful that brother was able to break free and join us. I'm going to be quiet. Brother Demetric, would you please come on and share?
Brother Scott.
Yes, sir.
To Brother Scott, to Brother Dennis, to allow me to extend my greetings to you of Assalamu Alaikum, peace to each one of the panelists. It's a great honor to be among such distinguished brothers as we talk about a distinguished brother, Minister Malcolm X. And so it's great to be a part of the platform, and so much has been shared already that is so constructive. The kind of great wisdom and insight that's been shared. You just wish there were more people here to see it and benefit from it. But I'm happy again to be a part of it as a student minister within the Nation of Islam, the leadership of the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. And so I wanted to just make a few points because there's, as everyone on this panel knows, there's so much in terms of the available literature about the life and the work of Minister Malcolm X. And there's a great deal about his assassination as well. And our contribution to the available literature is from what we can see the first response from the believing community, Islam, as an analysis of the assassination of Minister Malcolm X, and they respond and rebuttal to the mythology and what we deem the propagandist efforts to not only assassinate Minister Malcolm, but to simultaneously assassinate the movement and the community that helped to give birth to Minister Malcolm. And so we're very happy with what we have been able to document and present. That is a vindication of the Demetric Muhammad, Minister Farrakhan, and the Nation of Islam, but a vindication of the sincerity of Black America. As Brother Scott mentioned, this period of time that we are having this panel discussion is in the immediate aftermath, even though it was planned prior to and without knowledge of, it's in the immediate aftermath of a press conference where a family member of a former New York Police Department undercover agent provocateur left something of a deathbed confession, even though in my consultation with attorneys, it doesn't quite rise to the level of a deathbed confession, seeing as how Raymond Wood lived another 10 years. But be that as it may, is very important, particularly because we have documented admission of the role of another agency, the New York Police Department, being nefarious as it relates to the lives of Black people in America. And when I heard the statement and read the statement and read the book, one of the most important aspects of what Raymond Wood dictated to his cousin Reggie Wood was, of course, not so much new to the folk that's on this panel, but certainly new to and a confirmation for the work that folk on this panel and other folk like us have done, was when he talked about that he was hired and paid to encourage members of organizations to commit felonious acts. That was the most powerful aspect of the recent revelations, because again, it confirmed, as Brother Dennis talked about, political papers, which we all know is the tip of the iceberg of what is available if the files would be released to the American public, all of the files. But important confirmation of the previous work that has been done by those examining the federal government's hidden hand in the discrediting and the destruction of the Black movement in America for justice and liberation. And I think it should be screamed from the mountaintops, because even though our conversation is specific today, talking about the life, the work, and especially the assassination of Minister Malcolm X, but such a statement by an agent provocateur from the 60s has wider implications, especially when we consider the well-known problem of many Black men and women who have felony convictions, such that now you have groups like the Innocence Project, you have the rise of the reentry field and other efforts working to help those who are really under double jeopardy in America. They've already served it, but they frequently have to serve time again or be penalized again based on the restriction that accompany having a felony conviction. So when police departments are hiring Black folk to encourage other Black folk to commit felonies simply because those police departments, those federal law enforcement agencies disagreed with our political views, disagreed with religious ideas, and most importantly, wanted desperately to maintain status quo in America of a white power structure as a master over a Black man as a slave. This has to be a rallying point, in my humble judgment, for all of us who are conscientious within the Black community and want to see our community experience liberation. And so we have a lot of material that's in the book, over 400 sources, and it helps us again to lift up our eyes away from the hand that's on the trigger, even though it may be a Black hand. These are the information and documentation of our government's role as puppet masters, working to make Uncle Toms, stew pigeons, and patsies. And so I have a couple of slides, Brother Scott, if I can remember how to do it here. I think I have to do it this way. And
got it.
You're able to see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, just a few slides just to talk a little bit about our work on this topic, and how it really intersects with your theme, Brother Scott, which is I think more than a novel concept, post-traumatic assassination syndrome. I really want to say that I really appreciate you sharing the clip from the great and legendary Reverend Bevel, because hearing him talk about post-traumatic assassination syndrome was very helpful for me to wrap my mind around the concept. And I think that as time goes on, that will become more of a household word, because I agree with Reverend Bevel, as long as the truth remains hidden, our community in many ways is on pause, and our community in many ways bears other evidence that the assassination of our leaders and the assassination of political leaders, period, creates a myriad of pathologies and ill effects on the desire of the masses of the people to challenge the forces that be with liberation are concerned. So that is a very important subject. The book here, we kind of go through the reemergence of Minister Malcolm into public life, because for 30 years, Malcolm remained outside of mainstream America. And we trace the reintroduction of Minister Malcolm into the public scene in mainstream America as a pop culture icon for Black, time of the ramp up of the rebuilding of the Nation of Islam by Minister Farrakhan. And I think we quoted Professor Michael Eric Dyson when he talked about the complex forces converging to lift Minister Malcolm from beyond the grave, which is in stark contrast to how he was remembered in the immediate aftermath of his assassination by the mainstream public. Professor read the beautiful aspects of the beautiful eulogy from Ossie Davis But in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other mainstream periodicals, Minister Malcolm was excoriated and condemned. And so for mainstream America to fasten upon him in the mid to late 80s and early 90s during a period of time when Minister Farrakhan was filling stadiums and arenas, and you had hip hop music, many rap artists communicating the idea of Black nationalism and Black nationalist Islam, you begin to see at that time the introduction of, once again, of Minister Malcolm, and you see pop culture, hip hop music begin to distribute a different kind of message. So we talk about that in the book. We cite some of the work of Professor Matthias Gardel, just to document that during the 1980s and 90s, Minister Farrakhan became a thorn in the side of federal law enforcement agencies, and certainly the Jewish leadership, as I'm sure Brother Dennis is familiar with, and his great work and standing against the Anti-Defamation League. But many people were upset that the nation was back and the minister was on the scene and saying the things that he was saying and having the impact that he had. And this is some more just data from, as Professor Gardel, the minister's magnetism, especially among the youth. And he talks about, again, how young people during the 80s and 90s were really coming alive to many of the ideas that, you know, kind of went away, especially after 1975 with the departure of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the shifting away from the Nation of Islam from Black separation, Black independence, more toward being purely a religious community pursuing the path of Sunni orthodoxy. So in the 80s and 90s, with the rebuilding under Minister Farrakhan, you had those ideas that Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad represented, Marcus Garvey, and other nationalist thinkers, which were some of the most hated ideas from the white power structure. They were re-entering among the young. And we all know that it was Hoover, COINTELPRO memos, as one of his line items to ensure that so-called Black nationalist hate type organizations do not attract youthful adherents. So Black nationalism becoming popular among the youth has always been a problem for the powers that be. I'm gonna fast forward through some of it. Of course, we titled our work, "But Didn't Y'all Kill Malcolm?" because that has become like a refrain. I don't care, I've been all over America to actually speak to inmates inside of Norfolk Correctional and Concord Correctional, two facilities, a part of the Massachusetts Department of where Brother Malcolm was housed. And I don't care where I am or where I have gone, invariably. And so being a part of Minister research team over the years within me to actually respond in written form so that we could have a document that people could consider, people could read, people could see an analysis from within the nation. Many people who are sincere who raised this question, I think, have for so long the general public, been like so many in the general public, feeding from sources that are hostile to the nation from the start. And so we're prayerful that our contribution will appeal to objective people to see an analysis from within the Nation of Islam community. I do a presentation called the Top 10 Myths about the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, and myth number 10 was that the minister murdered Malcolm X. And at that time, this was a few years ago, if you put that into Google, you would get about 128,000 Google search results from that search query. And in the presentation, as well as in the book, we talk about The brothers from Mosque Number 7 who were arrested. Talmadge Hare was not from Mosque Number 7. He's the only admitted killer who served 45 years in prison. But these two brothers, Norman 3X Butler, who became Muhammad Abdul Aziz, and Brother Thomas 15X Johnson, who became Khalil Islam, were not at the Audubon that day. And they were innocent men who served a great period of time in prison because, again, the assassination of Malcolm X was a part of the destruction of the Nation of Islam and the overall destruction of all of the movements that our people had formed. I mean, it's a heck of a thing to pause to reflect that simply because as members of the Black community, and we were tired of having white America's foot on our neck. And so some of us joined Dr. King's movement and we were part of the civil rights aspect of the struggle. Others joined the Nation of Islam. Some joined the Panthers, CORE, SNCC, etc. It didn't matter to J. Edgar Hoover. It didn't matter to New York Police. It didn't matter to the ADL. They had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo in America. But for being sincere men and women, only desiring justice and liberation, we became targets. We were painted as subversives. We were considered to be candidates or communist sympathizers. This history is extraordinary when you get into a lot of the details of it. But we talk about this in our book because we wanted to show how, again, Malcolm assassinated, but his assassination was blamed on the nation. There's Jim Vanderwall and Ward Churchill's version of Pro. And they talk about this particular memo wherein some of the special agents in charge were pointing to Minister Malcolm's assassination as an example of successful COINTELPRO operation. So in words, if they had to go to renew their budget, they had to show successes. They had to show what did they achieve. And so they pointed to Malcolm's assassination and how they had worked to create a factional within the nation as an example of the success of the COINTELPRO operation. And that's just the verbatim of it. And it's Professor Martha, Canadian professor, also talking about the way propaganda has been put forth to say that the Nation of Islam is responsible for crime and violence, the assassination of Malcolm X, etc. But she importantly notes that it was law enforcement agencies that fostered violence in hopes of destroying the Nation of Islam. We point to Dr. King's assassination in our work because I live in Memphis, Tennessee in 1999. The jury concluded that it was federal that was responsible for Dr. King's assassination. And people like Gene Roberts and Raymond Wood, you had Merrill McCullough, who on the scene from the Memphis Police Department at Dr. King's assassination. And so, you know, I always raise this question: if the government is responsible for orchestrating the assassination of King, who preached a much milder doctrine than did Malcolm X, how could we believe Mr. Malcolm B? So we go into a lot of detail of that. And then we conclude with getting into some of the assassination itself and point to a lot of the testimonies of Minister Malcolm's in the circle. Sister Ella, another one of those very important figures in Minister Malcolm's life, who's absent from Spike Lee's movie. And I have to say that, you know, I think that as we talk, Brother Scott, about post-traumatic assassination syndrome, I don't know if it can be completely considered post, because post kind of means you're on the other side of the thing. But, you know, nowadays, really a campaign and a phenomenon of the posthumous nation of the and the true history of many of our heroes and heroines from the Black struggle. You look at Spike Lee's movie, when you look at a lot of other mainstream movies, books and things that are put out, we see a corruption of history such that many of our youth literally walk away from these films and these big budget productions believing that what they have watched on television or saw in a movie is actually how it happened. And this is disturbing because in Professor Marable's book, for instance, you know, he talks about Malcolm may have been a homosexual. You have just maybe a year ago people saying that Dr. King stood by and allowed a woman to get raped. You have all of these things that are now being attached to the legacies of great ones. And so from my vantage point, at least, that's a part of the assassination. It's one thing to kill a man's body, but then you go and you manipulate his legacy. You make him something that he wasn't in life. You change who he was in death so that the babies, the youth of Black America won't be inspired to follow in their footsteps. So Ella Collins, in that film, we talk about Ella Collins in the book. We talk about people like Brother James, 67X in the book, and the things that he said about those who were involved in Malcolm's assassination and in not being the Nation of Islam. He, Sarah Mitchell, whom we were blessed to spend time with, you know, they were those who assassinated Malcolm, potentially coming after them. They left the country for a period of time. And the book starts out talking about propaganda. And one of the things that we noticed was that in the 60s, in the immediate aftermath of Malcolm's assassination, the zeitgeist among the Black public was clear that the government did it. But fast forward 30 years later, you know, I'm posed with questions day in and day out, but didn't y'all kill Malcolm? So you see propaganda, which again is an aspect and a weapon of those who want to keep Black people suffering from post-traumatic assassination syndrome. Talk about James Fong and how he documents that Malcolm had petitioned the State Department for help, especially when life was threatened overseas, and they refused to give help and support to Brother Malcolm. Hoover's infamous memo, Do Something, Malcolm X, which this is very significant because of the timing of it being in the summer of 1964. The summer of 64 significant in the assassination of Malcolm X because in the summer of 64 there were uprisings or riots, and white merchants and Jewish merchants especially suffered during the summer of 64 in New York City, as well as Rochester, New York. And one of the things that we did, Brother Dennis, that I think you appreciate is that we looked at how the false charge of anti-Semitism factored into the assassination. And we were surprised, or maybe the old ADL at the scene of the crime, both literally and figuratively, but they were beating a drumbeat in their periodicals, condemning some of the passages from Jewish newspapers and periodicals where they blamed Mr. Malcolm's violence against Jewish merchants in the summer of 1964. And so for Edgar Hoover to do something about Malcolm X, enough of this black violence is connected to it, because also Edgar Hoover has sent forth a memo to all of the FBI field officers immediately begin cooperation and liaisoning with the regional ADL office in the area and sharing information, sharing resources, etc. So probably for the first time in a book about the assassination of Malcolm X, we introduce this issue of alleged anti-Semitism of black leaders, particularly those like Malcolm, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Minister Farrakhan, and others whose message to black people had a strong economic component. The final couple of slides I shared a couple of days ago on social media when we were reviewing the church committee reports, which go into details and as I've shared with other people, and I'm happy to hear the backstory about the college campuses and breaking COINTELPRO, because nowadays folk talk about COINTELPRO like, you know, everybody always knew about it, but there was a day and a time when people only suspected that the government was doing things to sabotage the black movement. But after the COINTELPRO came, the church committee hearings, the general public for the first time had some detail and confirmation that in fact the law enforcement agencies, FBI, CIA, NYPD, and others were involved in inspiring violence and bloodshed among black groups who were fighting on behalf of our people. So in this excerpt, it talks about trying to inspire a war between the Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers area around the sales and distribution of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, spark a feud, which when you consider that the nation has a paramilitary, consider that the Black Panthers have a paramilitary structure and believed in carrying arms, then, you know, we understand that their plan was to cause to ultimately kill each other. We talk about, again, the agent provocateur, which Mr. Raymond Wood's letter helps us to have some connection to a real world figure who was such. He stated that he was arrested. He was the second man that was arrested that day, and that the police department went and picked up Thomas 15X Johnson, who was a member of Mile 7, to hide and to protect Raymond Wood's identity. But again, I challenge that term, Brother Scott, of post, because so many of these things that the government did to facilitate assassinating black leaders are still going on today, and not so-called reputable organizations. But I work a lot with black youth, and I work a lot with incarcerated brothers and sisters, and you know, I tell them all the time, a lot of the so-called gang violence that they go through is born out of them being infiltrated and having agent provocateurs among them. And so this is a word that I hope become a household word in Black America. And of course, this is Ray Wood, Gene Roberts, and Darthur Perry, who's another very intriguing character who talks a lot about his work in destroying the Watts Actor Studio. You know, and I always think about, you know, the links that they went to destroy his studio. They were not the Nation of Islam or the Black Panther Party, but what this man has reported is extraordinary when you consider that it was simply an actor studio. And so again, we talked about Ray Wood in our book, but again, his revelations through his cousin is very important. And I hope that it would be a cause and an occasion for those who are concerned about overcoming post-traumatic assassination syndrome, that we could come and go through all of the steps. We can say that perhaps they will never release their files, but I think that we should speak with one voice on this issue and demand that the NYPD bossy release their files, demand that the FBI release the rest of their files, and go after groups even like the ADL, because in 1959, there was a flood of negative propaganda that came forth in mainstream publications that was negative about the Nation of Islam. And in Carl Evans's work, he talks about how it was who asked, who did he think was behind the flood of negative propaganda aimed at the Nation of Islam? And Carl Evans says that Malcolm at that time told him that he had learned from sources in law enforcement that there was a Jewish group called Breath who had a separate set of files that they had been keeping on the Nation of Islam. And in some of our research and in the book, we include some of what we found in available files from the ADL to see the hidden hands that were involved, because far too long, a part of our trauma being compounded is that not only did they kill our leaders, but they blamed us for killing our leaders when they knew that they were behind the scenes orchestrating all of it. So I think that's all of my slides, Scott. Oh yeah, that's the Mr. Hoover with the ADL youth. And that is just a quote from the memo that he sent out to all of his operatives about making sure that they immediately establish a liaison with the ADL. Now, this came out in the late 60s. However, there are FBI officers that reported to Director Hoover that they had already been working with the ADL for at least 10 years or more. But these are occasions for us to come together and to pursue that the truth come out, because when the truth comes out, I believe it will exonerate Black folk, not just the nation, because the exonerating the evidence does that. But Black America, as you point out, Brother Scott, we are suffering. So what happened behind the scenes so that the case can be made that just for wanting justice, our government targeted some of our best and brightest. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I didn't. I thought I only had a few slides. I had more than I thought. But
y'all are the reason for the season, man. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You. I want to read one piece before we open up. In fact, we can open up for questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask any of our presiding scholars? If you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we can ask Dr. Robertson, Mr. Speed, or Student Minister Demetric. Well, I'm going to take this opportunity. Oh, and one more time, y'all. But didn't y'all kill Malcolm? Get this book. You will not be disappointed. You know, Brother Demetric did not, he barely scratched the surface of what is in this book. I think, how many footnotes? About 400?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's a little over.
Yeah, it's awesome. I want to mention a couple things. One, the Jubilee Film Festival is it's ongoing right now. If you'd like to support our efforts and the independent filmmakers, please go and get an all-access pass. It allows unlimited viewings of any of the films. I would, man, if you have not saw Medical Racism, please go and see Medical Racism. Every black man, woman, and child needs to see that yesterday, really. The film about Cuba and COVID, you need to see that. So all access pass, unlimited viewings through Sunday night. I want to take a moment to read something. This is a book, a piece of a book that we published in 2015 with Reverend Bevel's biographer. It's called Months on the Mountain, the Selma Voting Rights Movement. And he had a message in here for all of us young people. I'm young, Dennis, don't do that. For all us young people
Anything?
who would be about the work of movement. And it's called The Disorders in Some People. He said, a lot of hotheads and so-called radicals came to Selma. I can't call them authentic radicals. They were just very irrational people who didn't understand strategy and despised white folks. The type who dealt in, you cowards, we's better and braver than y'all. That kind of erratic negativity and non-thinking people was present. These angry folks began to agitate the crowd. You sold out, they'd scream, not understanding the situation or the fact that the people in charge of strategy knew what they were doing. They thought the drama was about a particular one-time demonstration when the drama was about the right to vote, no more and no less. But these people now believe that the entire civil rights movement has suddenly become a contest of black folks versus white folks. Seeing themselves as the vanguard of some kind of black revolution, their unresolved lies and hates cause them to act contradictory to the nonviolent tenets. They even began to make agreements in opposition to Dr. King and the nonviolent movement. They didn't understand one thing. Since our movement addressed errors in both black and white people, we were doing principled clinical education work, not competitive racial work. Some of you reading these words may create the movements of the future. You'll be experiencing and thinking about the problems. Since other people at various moments in history have thoroughly tested the science of nonviolence and found it to be true, be assured those problems can be resolved. What you need to learn does not include who did this or who did that, what hero got his name in the paper, or which heroine brought a movement to a conclusion, or even why they did what they did. You'll need to know the disorders in people which cause them not to think a question all the way through. And you'll need to know the disorders which motivate them to act irrationally. You need to understand that polite haters usually have problems with energetic people. Understand that every compromised person has a problem with the uncompromised and yet won't admit it. You need to know that these hidden but constantly present attitudes will directly affect your group's ability to solve social problems. You need to know that hate comes when someone imagines an external enemy and then feels intellectually and physically intimidated by their mental attitude towards this perceived foe. You should become keenly aware that if you have haters in your movement, their hatred will contribute to injustice. At some point, they will take serious action to counter justice and compromise truth. In Selma, these haters, mostly SNCC activists who assumed after talking with other people who felt the same way that their us against them attitude now defined the movement. joined Sheriff Jim Clark and his deputies in acting out their rage. This led to many minor incidents and actions which ran contrary to a movement designed explicitly to do one thing: obtain the right to vote. These incidents increased after Bloody Sunday. To deal with this negative force, we had to do both internal and external movement work, all during the Selma campaign. He said that our biggest problem is not being questioned all the way through. I want to pose something to you. The stated aim of J. Edgar Hoover during his reign of terror was to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. Then he added something to that. He said, who would unify and electrify the masses. He would unify Black militant groups who were splintered and disparate, and he would bring them together and he would electrify them, bring life energy to them. I said, okay. Now, when I hear the word Messiah, and this is just, I don't want to offend anybody, but what I want to do is I want to just briefly, I am a Black man who was raised in a religion that my grandparents learned at the end of a whip. Their grandparents learned it at the end of a whip. Then it was imposed on me. So the term Messiah, when I hear it, it has the qualities of this slave religion attached to it. When I hear Messiah, I think mystical, mythical, magical. You know, if you the Messiah, you at least got to be able to walk on some water. You know what I mean, Dr. Robertson? If you can't walk on some water, I can't call you Messiah. That's the thinking that comes with this imposed religion. But J. Edgar Hoover made something clear. He defined the Messiah differently. He didn't define him in the magical terms. He said that the Messiah would unify the Black masses, and he worked hard to prevent that. A big part of that was the murder of Malcolm X and the hanging of that murder around the neck of the Nation of Islam. And then, to get specific, they wanted to hang it around the neck of Minister Farrakhan. Why? Did y'all see the Million Man March? Were not all the Black organizations there? Did he not give them time to speak? Can you think a question all the way through? Who called the people together in Washington, D.C.? Your enemy says, by his definition, what you saw was the Messiah in action. I don't care to argue religious or theological misunderstandings. I want to deal with something factual. Who called the Black masses together October 16th, 1995? All of the Black groups was there, but if you were there around 4:30, 5 o'clock, you heard people saying, we want Farrakhan. They didn't even want to hear from anybody else. That's what all of us was saying. Everybody wanted to hear from him. Can you think a question all the way through? You need to know the disorders in people that don't allow us to think these things through, and the disorders that make us act irrationally. Who called the Million Man March, man? Who did? Look, when we got to DC, a lot of us went and we was like, I'm down for whatever. I'm sick of this. So when we get here, whatever is going on can go on. But what did this man that J. Edgar Hoover saw in his mind as messianic, what did he tell us to do? He said, repent. The kingdom of your Lord is at hand. Atone. Can you think a question all the way through? What did you actually see? Just wanted to put that on people's minds. We have Tyra Marshall saying, are you saying you think SNCC was disproportionately infiltrated compared to the other organizations involved in the Selma marches and the civil rights movement, would like input from brothers Dennis and Robertson?
Well, let
So
me,
please, my brother.
I've heard you, and I must pay a debt of gratitude and much respect to Brother Minister Demetric. Your team has assembled a level of scholarship that masters attain. Your books generally are filled with irrefutable amounts of evidence. Kudos to you, brother. Now, getting to Selma, I think we oversimplify a lot of things. When we look at Selma and we do not mention Jimmy Lee Jackson, we do a disservice. A lot of the people were speaking out in Selma because they had murdered Jimmy Lee Jackson. The sheriffs had murdered Jimmy Lee Jackson. His death reignited that movement. So yes, it was initially assembled for voting rights, but it took on a whole different meaning when Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered. We don't mention tile in these discussions. Students from Tuskegee who were not members of SNCC, but who were involved specifically in Tuskegee, but also in Lowndes County and also in Selma. So and that was not in the movie. We talk about what wasn't in Spike's movie, that wasn't in the Selma movie. So a lot of the nuances that caused Bevel to react to those persons who were reacting must be discussed and infused in these discussions if we're going to get at the truth. Secondly, relative to Malcolm, again, Reverend Minister, much kudos to you. But I don't look at Malcolm relative to his popular culture. Malcolm died in '65. Brother Dennis was involved in student movements beginning in '67. Almost immediately after Malcolm's death, those persons who eventually birthed Black studies were involved in deep structured analysis of his works and his words and his deeds and his actions and his ideologies. Immediately upon his death, I don't care what popular culture does, Hollywood, I'm talking about those young brothers and sisters who coalesced all across the country and birthed Black studies. First at San Francisco State, of course, at Merritt College in Oakland, before it reached San Francisco State. We're talking about Bobby Seals and Huey Newton and those people who eventually became Black Panthers while they were at Merritt College. They grabbed hold immediately onto the words of Malcolm, onto the deeds and the memories and the legacy of Malcolm. So Malcolm, with a great deal of very many people, never died. His ideology, the Los Angeles Times and New Orleans Times Picayune, they're going to belch against everything and everybody who has a liberation agenda. To this day, they'll do it. But Malcolm and those persons, the Black student unions, beginning at Knox College in Illinois, they never did relinquish Malcolm. They never did relinquish Malcolm. They never did move him to the side. And he remained with them immediately upon his martyrdom, and he remains with Africana studies, Africologists, and Africology to this day. Those are just my two contributions to this post discussion.
I thank you very much for that. I think one of the things that has been made clear in Brother Demetric's presentation, your observations about what happened in terms of his scholarship in that, but what you just said is that we require a way to present this, not even to thousands of people. People like to say that often, but those of us who were involved in the seminars, sometimes we would have these meetings at the colleges, 25, 30 people, and those people formed a nucleus over a period of time that then continued for decades. I'm referencing this because it's the nuance part of this. For example, Bevel being the person that stated we need to take the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson to Montgomery. And that's what the Selma to Montgomery March was. It was not a benign action. In the same way that Bevel also said in Birmingham, because of the injunction against King, we need to march on that cracker in Washington, referring to JFK, which people don't like to remember occurred. And then Malcolm's discussion about the March on Washington as the world's biggest picnic, or the biggest picnic in American history, right? Which was a thing, and saying before the march, really the issue in Birmingham was also the rising up of the Black community, apart from even the Children's March now, in reaction to what was happening with that Children's March, and how this created a leverage point for Dr. King going into Washington. And I'm only going to reference these things because they're very useful. And the nuance of history is what I think we want to really get people to get a very clear idea about. Just to say concerning this question of what was said already about the Anti-Defamation League, you have to note that, remember the Roberts brothers who were involved in the Mississippi situation in 64. These were people who had a certain relationship also to ADL and other connections. Now it's interesting because, but it was mainly the FBI. Now let me just say, this whole issue of the FBI, one last cultural note. The very first case J. Edgar Hoover worked on, Marcus Garvey. Very first case. Malcolm's father, what was he? Universal Negro Improvement Association. So if you look at the arc of continuity here, in terms of what we are talking about, I think this will, it's a very helpful and productive discussion, not just about a discussion, but about how we can make people think about the fact that the divisions that are being made now did not exist then. Okay? You know, it's like you would not have divided, as we all know, Miles Davis from Louis Armstrong, from Ornette Coleman, from Coltrane. You would not, that it wasn't a practical division. You were listening to all of this. It was one thing. It was one response. And I think that this should just be remembered by people as we go further. And I think in terms of the moment, this moment, you pointed out, Brother Demetric, something very important, which I need to think about concerning the resurrection of Malcolm at a certain point by popular culture. Now we're talking, which was a different thing. I think that's critical. What Dr. Robertson said. And you remember, Public Enemy is doing a certain kind of a thing. They're talking about getting 5,000 organizers to go into the Black community. All right. Professor Griff is reading, right? Certain relationship between Blacks and Jews and other things, gets into trouble because he references it. Next thing we know, bam, they're gone or suppressed. Then we got the other thing, right? The gangster rap thing. So it's a very important discussion because the way in which the moment of 1965, October 16th, Monday, okay, transformed all of not only America, Muammar Gaddafi talked about the fact that the leading Muslim in the world at that moment was now Minister Louis Farrakhan. So it was an international effect at that moment. And then that was caused to be turned off. We shouldn't even, in my view, misestimate what happened around Osama bin Laden with respect to that. I'm not making causal relations. I'm talking here about the notion of how agencies understanding that in-depth cultural transformations of people inspire revolutionary impulses, right? And you can't control that. It becomes owned by everybody. And how it manifests, nobody can control. So if you try to therefore put that back in the lid, put that back under the under the covers, you can take several different layers and you can intervene in this very layered approach. Final thing, Malcolm and Africa. Remember, the Organization for Afro-American Unity and his approach there, when what was going on with the poisoning in Egypt of Malcolm, and then all these other things that were going on, right? Or like the question was asked, who stopped him from landing in France? Okay, that wasn't NOI. So I think this is just another component of what we're talking about here, which is important. It's Division 5 of the FBI. That's the Foreign Intelligence Division of the FBI. Always keep that in mind, because that's an interface between CIA and the domestic operations of FBI. And under that rubric, they can do things that are supposed to be illegal under American law and get away with it.
Excellent commentary from everyone. I certainly agree with everything that's been stated, and I think that the nuance or the specificity of Professor Robertson is appropriate, because of course the Panthers were a group of youth who picked up Malcolm's mantle and inspiration and formed the Black Panther Party. I think that certain pockets and certain sectors always keep a torch for movements, even if it's not that same kind of thing among the masses. And when you get into a lot of the sentiment of the government, especially after 1975, with the departure of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and how they documented that they hired his son. He was really their candidate, if you will, to lead of the nation. They don't hide this because they had always stated that they wanted the nation to depart from its call for a separate state and territory and just basically deal with self-improvement and religion. So they end up with this. And since the nation had a vanguard position in Black nationalism, especially after these agencies that were CORE, SNCC, Panthers, SELC to a certain extent, after 1975, between the late 70s and early 80s, you know, you have this kind of movement is in flux. And when the minister stands to rebuild the nation beginning in 1977 and begins to, as you pointed out, Dr. Speed, have basically as de jure, you know, the minister was rebuilding the nation. And most of those who have been in the nation prior to 75 were not helping him. So he essentially starts by himself. But a wonderful development happens. His message catches on with hip hop artists. And so as the nation is being reborn, hip hop is having its ascendancy. And there's this complementary relationship. And I tell people all the time, I was a teenager in 1990. And what I heard coming from Minister Farrakhan or his ministers at Mosque, when I left the mosque and I put on my Sony Walkman, back when we were still playing tapes, I could hear the same ideas expressed in the artists of my generation. And I talk to my children all the time about it. It just came in here, and I said, you know, they're conscious artists today, but they're marginalized. They're periphery. But in my coming of age as a teenager, because I joined the nation in the 10th grade, what helped facilitate that was the fact that there was no line of demarcation between what I heard Minister Farrakhan saying and what Public Enemy was saying, what all of the 5% artists were saying. And so mainstream hip hop at that time had a black nationalist orientation. You didn't have strippers as a part of mainstream hip hop at that time. You didn't have Poppin' Percocet and Molly as a part of mainstream hip hop at that time. You don't have this promotion of conspicuous consumption and materialism as a part of hip hop at that time. And so hip hop is turned. And as an element within that, we see Malcolm is put on a postage stamp. Well, how's a man that was once upon a time the leading black anti-Semite, a man that they said wasted his talent and his youth pursuing the path of hatred. This is how he was memorialized in newspapers all over the country. 30 years later, you put him on a postage stamp. I could accept this rapprochement by mainstream America if you decided not only to put Malcolm on a postage stamp, but now paved the way for his ideology. But yet his ideologies are still anathema among the mainstream while he's put on postage stamps, t-shirts, etc. And so what accompanied that reintroduction into the mainstream, not in academia and not in the movement, but in the mainstream among young people that don't, you know, I tell this story sometimes because I work a lot with the youth. And one of my colleagues, he showed some young people a picture of Frederick Douglass. And he said, do you all know who this man is? They said, yeah, we know who he is. That's Fred Sanford. So among the masses of the youth, many of the folk that you and I talk about, because our head is in certain stuff, they just don't have a clue, you know? And so Malcolm was put in that arena. And at the same time, the youth were told Farrakhan called for his death. And so we talk about Gabe Pressman and Jack Newfield of the New York Post engaging in gotcha journalism. And they play a clip of the minister. And the minister's in the passion of his speech. And he says something like, well, you know, was Malcolm your traitor or was he ours? What stop the tape? Now, the clip is about 5 or 6 minutes. If you play the whole clip, there's something that comes after you, not saying that the nation was involved in assassinating Malcolm. But they give her that to get a reaction on. They planned a series that would go in the Post for assassinating Malcolm. So that's my problem with how Malcolm was introduced to the mainstream, because while his image and his name was introduced, we don't see any commitment from mainstream, either media or government, to promote his ideas. Not just the ideas that he espoused when he was in the nation, but even the ideas that he espoused when he started OAA and, you know, but he injected in a safe way, in a sense. And when Professor out repeating stuff that Bruce Perry had said years earlier about Malcolm's sexuality, now all of a sudden Malcolm's a champion of LGBTQ. So, you know, again, this is, to me, this is because it's a soapbox issue for me, the corruption of our history, because you know, the youth are made to look with a jaundiced eye at people they should be seeing. And I need to take the baton from a Booker T and work in the field of Black independent education. I need to take the baton from Brother Malcolm in internationalizing the Black struggle. I need to take the baton from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and building a nation for our people. But these agencies that were part of assassinating our leaders and destroying our leaders are now working to assassinate their character posthumously. And that was my only point.
To piggyback off of what you've just stated, the great historian John Henry Clark once said, before Europeans enslaved African bodies, they enslaved African history. Because you can't enslave a human being who accomplishes things. So you strip the accomplishments from these human beings, reducing them to the level of beasts, and now you can enslave them. So clearly I understand what you're saying, but do know, as you well do, I'm talking to some of the audience members who may not, there were significant numbers of people at that same time that the popular press demonized Malcolm's message while elevating his image. There were significant numbers of people across this country continuing to support their work by using Malcolm's ideology. And so as now, PhDs in Africology all over the country, most of, not all of which, most of which is undergirded by the messages and the foundations of Malcolm and other nationalists who, as I stated in my brief presentation, who existed prior to Malcolm and who influenced him with their words and their deeds and their actions. So you're absolutely correct, but there are also other people who worked against mainstream to establish institutions that remain today and pursue the image and the ideology of Omar Wally Shabazz. Globally, I might add.
Brother Scott, sorry, I have to go to.
Yeah, I'm getting poked over here because they telling me that we went over time 22 minutes exactly. I'm not gonna tell you who's doing the poking, but all my close friends know who be doing the poking. Hey, listen.
No, brother. Brother, any husband knows who's doing the poking.
He does not. Hey, look, y'all. This was.
Oh, you froze.
We're planning.
We think we understand you.
You frozen, Brother Scott.
You know, that's how it be when you're in a place and they want you to leave and they turn the lights off. You ain't got to go home, but you got to get up out of here.
Right.
That's the electronic version of flicking the lights. You don't have to go home, but you got to get.
All right, well, gentlemen, I'm gonna exit. Thank you both, and thank you, Brother Scott. And I'm definitely want to be in touch with you and exchange more.
Definitely appreciate it.
Well, Brother Scott has my information, brothers, and he has yours. So I hope I'm offering whatever assistance I can bring to bear to you, and I'm sure that invitation from you is extended to me.
Yes, sir. Thank you both, brothers. I really enjoyed it, and hope we can do this again and stay in touch. And of course, to Brother Dennis, I've read your articles over the years, so you know I'm a fan of your work. Really happy to get a chance to see you and engage with you. And Professor Robertson, I'm getting a chance to meet you and know you for the first time, and I'm really very honored and really enjoyed your words.
Thank you, brother, and it's reciprocated.
All right. So in the words of peace.
All right. So.
Walaikum salam.
Walaikum assalam. Hotep, peace and power, brothers.